Daniel Hartwell always believed numbers told the truth. People lied, emotions lied, memories lied. But numbers never did. And that was exactly why, when his marriage started collapsing, he didn't argue, he didn't scream, he didn't confront, he audited. And what he discovered didn't just destroy an affair, it destroyed an entire life. It started on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in Charlotte, when the crunch of metal against metal echoed through the parking lot, and Daniel Hartwell felt the impact ripple through his Toyota Camry before he even understood what had happened. He sat perfectly still, gripping the steering wheel, watching in his rearview mirror as steam rose from the hood of a luxury SUV that had just slammed into his rear bumper with enough force to jolt his entire body forward against the seatbelt. The driver stumbled out of the SUV looking like he had just stepped off the cover of a business magazine. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Daniel earned in a week. He had a phone pressed to his ear and was still mid-conversation, not even bothering to check whether the person he had just hit was injured or bleeding or dead. No, I can handle this," the man was saying, his voice carrying across the asphalt with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. Just some nobody in a beater car. Daniel stepped out slowly, adjusting his glasses and straightening his jacket with the careful precision of a man who measured his life in columns and decimal points. The man looked vaguely familiar, clean-shaven with a confident smirk permanently etched across his face, the kind of person who walked into every room believing he owned it and left every room having convinced everyone else of the same thing. "Sorry about that," the man said without a trace of genuine apology in his voice. "Marcus Webb." He extended his hand without looking up from his phone, as though the introduction itself was a favor he was granting. "My insurance will handle everything. You were not hurt, were you?" Daniel shook the offered hand and noticed the expensive watch, the manicured nails, the faint smell of cologne that probably cost more than a decent bottle of whiskey. "Daniel Hartwell," he said quietly. "No, I am fine." Something shifted behind Marcus Webb's eyes at the sound of the name. "Hartwell, that is unusual," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You would not happen to know Rachel Hartwell, would you? Works in real estate compliance over at Whitfield & Partners." The question hit Daniel like a bucket of ice water poured down his spine on a freezing January morning. "She is my wife," he said carefully, keeping his voice even. Marcus Webb's smile widened into something that looked almost predatory. "Small world," he said. "She looked absolutely stunning at the conference last week. That red dress really brought out her eyes." Daniel felt something crack deep inside his chest, a hairline fracture running through the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his life. Rachel had told him she was working late last Tuesday. She had not mentioned any conference, and she had certainly not worn a red dress. She had left the house that morning in her usual gray pantsuit, kissed him on the cheek, and said she would probably be home after 9. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table when Rachel walked in and tossed her purse on the counter with the same effortless casualness she had perfected over 21 years of marriage. He asked about Kevin Webb and the conference at the Sheraton downtown. Rachel's hand paused over an envelope for just a fraction of a second before she recovered and called it a boring compliance meeting. Nothing worth mentioning. "He said you looked stunning in a red dress," Daniel pressed, and Rachel laughed, but the sound came out hollow and brittle. She said Marcus was probably confusing her with someone else and headed upstairs to shower. Her phone, forgotten on the counter, buzzed with a message from MW that read simply, "Cannot wait for next Thursday." Daniel stared at the screen until it went dark, then opened his laptop and began what he would later recognize as the first entry in a very different kind of ledger. Over the following week, Daniel paid attention to his wife in ways he had not done for years. He noticed the extra care she took with her makeup on certain mornings, the way she checked her phone constantly and turned it face down whenever he entered the room, and the subtle shifts in her schedule that had working late appearing more and more frequently alongside weekend errands that stretched for hours longer than they should have. As a senior budget analyst at Lakewood University, Daniel had spent 13 years developing an eye for irregularities and numbers that refused to add up, and now he turned that same relentless attention toward his own marriage. He started with their finances, and what he found made his stomach turn. Rachel had taken out a personal loan for $30,000 using both their names, but the money had never touched their joint accounts. She had also opened a separate credit card, whose statements revealed charges at expensive restaurants during her supposed late nights at the office, hotel bookings she had never mentioned, and lingerie purchases from stores she had never shopped at before. Their daughter Lily knocked on his office door around 2 in the morning and asked if he was okay. And when Daniel looked at his 16-year-old girl standing in the doorway with sleep in her eyes, she told him that her mother had been acting strange lately, secretly happy, humming when she thought nobody was listening, buying expensive new clothes. "Maybe she got a promotion," Lily said with a shrug, and Daniel nodded and said, "Maybe," even though the spreadsheet glowing on his monitor told a very different story. The next morning, Rachel announced she would be working late again, something about a big compliance review, and kissed Daniel on the cheek with lips that tasted like new lipstick before heading out the door. Daniel waited exactly 12 minutes, then called Lakewood University and told his supervisor he had a stomach virus that would keep him home for at least a day or two. It was the first sick day he had taken in over 4 years, and the lie came easier than he expected. He followed Rachel's silver sedan through the morning traffic of Charlotte, keeping 3 car lengths between them at all times, his heart hammering against his ribs like a fist pounding on a locked door. Rachel's office building was downtown, a sleek glass tower that housed Whitfield and Partners, along with several other firms that catered to people who wore expensive suits and made decisions that affected other people's money. Daniel parked across the street and waited with the patience of a man who had spent 13 years staring at budget reports until the numbers finally confessed their secrets. At 11:42 in the morning, Rachel emerged from the building and walked 3 blocks east to a coffee shop on the corner of Tryon Street. Marcus Webb was already there, sitting in a corner booth with the easy posture of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be comfortable. Daniel watched through the window as his wife slid into the seat across from Marcus and leaned forward with a smile he had not seen directed at himself in years. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, and Rachel did not pull away. They sat together for 37 minutes, and Daniel timed every single one of them on his watch. When they finally left the coffee shop, Marcus placed his hand on the small of Rachel's back, guiding her toward the parking garage with the proprietary confidence of a man who believed he had every right to touch another man's wife in broad daylight. Daniel followed at a careful distance, staying several cars behind as Marcus's repaired SUV merged onto the interstate heading south out of Charlotte. The Grandview Hotel sat 20 minutes outside the city in a quiet stretch of wooded hills, upscale enough to attract business travelers who valued discretion, but not so flashy that it would draw attention. Daniel parked at the far end of the lot and watched as Rachel and Marcus walked into the lobby together, their shoulders nearly touching, and they did not come out for 3 hours and 14 minutes. That evening, Rachel came home at her usual late hour and complained about the compliance review dragging on forever. And when she asked Daniel how his day had been, he told her it was quiet, just some budget projections, and she nodded and went upstairs to shower. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and opened a new spreadsheet on his laptop. This one had nothing to do with Lakewood University. This one tracked a different kind of accounting entirely, a balance sheet of his marriage with columns for lies told, trust broken, and betrayal compounding with interest at a rate that would have alarmed any honest auditor. Over the following weeks, Daniel developed a routine that was as precise and methodical as anything he had ever done in his professional career. He would call in sick, follow Rachel, and document everything with the obsessive thoroughness of a man building a case he never wanted to prosecute. Times, locations, duration of every meeting, all of it cataloged in spreadsheets that grew longer by the day. He learned that Wednesdays were their regular hotel days at the Grandview, and Fridays they met at Marcus's apartment, a sleek high-rise on South Boulevard that cost more per month than Daniel earned in an entire pay cycle at the university. Daniel also learned things about Marcus Webb that Rachel almost certainly did not know, and these discoveries changed everything. He found his way into Marcus's personal email account, which was secured with a password so predictable that Daniel cracked it on his 3rd attempt. And what he found inside made the affair look like the least of Marcus Webb's problems. Marcus was drowning in gambling debts from underground poker games that operated out of back rooms across Charlotte. His apartment was leased through Whitfield and Partners as a corporate perk. His car payments were 4 months behind, and he had been borrowing money from Rachel to cover his losses at the tables. Daniel traced the transfers and realized with a sickening clarity that it was his own money. Pulled from the $30,000 loan Rachel had taken out in both their names, that was funding Marcus Webb's gambling addiction. The final piece of that particular puzzle fell into place on a Wednesday in October. Daniel had positioned himself in the Grandview Hotel bar, nursing a black coffee and reading a newspaper, while Rachel and Marcus occupied their usual room 3 floors above. A young woman entered the lobby looking agitated and angry, and marched straight to the front desk, with the determination of someone who had run out of patience a long time ago. She announced loudly enough for Daniel to hear that she was a private investigator hired by Marcus Webb's wife Christine in Philadelphia, and that she knew he was in this hotel, and that either the front desk would help her find him or she would start checking every room herself. The desk clerk stammered something about privacy policies, but the woman was not interested in policies. Daniel folded his newspaper, left his coffee on the bar, and walked out to the parking lot where he sat in his Toyota Camry and stared at the hotel entrance for a very long time, understanding with perfect clarity that Marcus Webb's carefully constructed life was already beginning to develop cracks, and that with the right amount of pressure applied in exactly the right places, the whole thing would come crashing down. Daniel submitted his resignation to Lakewood University on a Monday morning, telling his supervisor he was taking early retirement to pursue private consulting opportunities. It was not entirely a lie, because he was indeed planning to consult extensively on a very specific project, one that required his full and undivided attention. He cleaned out his desk, shook hands with colleagues who wished him well, and drove straight to a commercial real estate office where he signed a 6-month lease on a small office space on the 4th floor of a building directly across the street from the glass tower that housed Whitfield and Partners. He paid with money from his retirement account and told himself it was an investment that would yield returns no mutual fund could ever match. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel transformed that bare office into a command center. He purchased a high-end camera with a telephoto lens, installed digital tracking software on a second-hand laptop, and pinned a detailed timeline to the wall behind his desk that mapped every movement Rachel and Marcus had made over the past month. He studied Marcus Webb's habits, financial records, and personal history with the same methodical precision he had once applied to university budgets, and what he discovered made the gambling debts and the affair look like minor entries on a much longer list of offenses. Marcus Webb was a house of cards built on a foundation of fraud and held together by nothing more than arrogance and luck. Daniel found evidence that Marcus had been skimming money from client accounts at Whitfield and Partners, small amounts carefully hidden beneath layers of legitimate transactions. But Daniel's trained eye spotted the irregularities the same way he had once spotted a miscoded expense line buried in a 40-page budget report. Marcus was also running an elaborate expense account fraud, billing personal dinners, hotel stays, and weekend trips to corporate cards, and then manipulating the reimbursement forms so that nobody would notice the discrepancies unless they knew exactly where to look. Daniel knew exactly where to look. But the most damning discovery was something that turned Daniel's stomach in a way that even the affair had not managed to do. Marcus had been embezzling funds from a charitable trust that Whitfield and Partners managed on behalf of a children's hospital foundation. The scheme was sophisticated enough to impress Daniel on a purely technical level, even as it disgusted him on every other level imaginable. Marcus would transfer money from the charity account to a shell company registered under a false name, let it sit for exactly 45 days to avoid triggering automated audit flags, then move it to a second account before returning most of the original amount to the charity fund. The missing portions accumulated slowly and quietly in an offshore account that Marcus probably believed was completely untraceable. Daniel traced it in 6 hours. He sat back in his office chair and stared at the numbers on his screen and felt something cold and sharp crystallize inside his chest, a certainty that had been building for weeks and had now hardened into something unbreakable. Armed with enough evidence to destroy Marcus Webb several times over, Daniel began to construct his response with the same care and patience he would have applied to a complex audit. The first move was subtle and surgical. He created an anonymous email account using a public library computer and sent a carefully worded tip to the internal audit department at Whitfield and Partners. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise suspicion about the source, just a polite suggestion that someone might want to take a closer look at certain unusual patterns in the company's expense reporting. He included enough specific details to guarantee their attention, but withheld enough to ensure the investigation would expand organically once auditors started pulling at the threads he had laid out for them. The second move was more personal. Daniel had learned that Marcus's wife Christine in Philadelphia was already growing suspicious about her husband's extended stays in Charlotte, and that Marcus had been feeding her increasingly flimsy stories about a long-term project that required him to maintain a local apartment. Daniel called Christine's office and identified himself as a concerned colleague of Marcus, who had noticed some troubling irregularities in shared project files. He suggested in a voice full of carefully calibrated worry that she might want to ask her husband some pointed questions about how he was spending his time in North Carolina. He was careful to sound like nothing more than a decent man looking out for a colleague's family, and Christine thanked him for his concern with a voice that told Daniel she had already suspected more than she was willing to admit. The third move targeted Rachel directly. Daniel had installed monitoring software on their home router weeks earlier, giving him access to everything Rachel did online. He discovered that she had been researching divorce attorneys in the Charlotte area and had already scheduled a consultation for the following week. She had also been transferring money from their joint savings account into her personal account in small, consistent amounts that she clearly hoped would go unnoticed. Daniel transferred every dollar back and then changed the access codes on the account. When Rachel tried to move money again, she found herself completely locked out, and the fact that she never once mentioned it to Daniel told him everything he needed to know about her plans for their marriage and for his money. But Daniel's most elegant move was still ahead of him. He contacted the private investigator he had seen at the Grandview Hotel, the woman hired by Christine to track Marcus down in Charlotte. Daniel identified himself as a concerned friend who had noticed Marcus acting strangely and who was worried about the people in his life being hurt by whatever trouble he had gotten himself into. He shared some of the financial evidence he had uncovered, enough to transform what had been a simple infidelity case into something much larger and much more valuable. The investigator was grateful for the information, and Daniel could hear the excitement in her voice as she realized that what she now held was not just proof of a cheating husband, but evidence of crimes that could put Marcus Webb behind bars for years. Within 2 weeks of Daniel setting his plan in motion, Marcus Webb's carefully constructed life began to collapse, like a building with its support beams quietly removed one by one. The internal audit at Whitfield and Partners expanded from a routine expense review into a full-scale investigation that consumed the entire compliance department and brought in outside forensic accountants who started digging into records that Marcus had assumed would never see the light of day. Linda Webb arrived in Charlotte unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, armed with credit card statements, bank records, and the private investigator's preliminary report that painted a picture of her husband's activities so unflattering that it would have been almost comical if it had not involved real money stolen from real people. Daniel watched it all unfold from his rented office across the street with the quiet satisfaction of a chess player who had thought 15 moves ahead and was now watching his opponent stumble into checkmate without even realizing the game was already over. He saw Marcus arriving at work earlier each morning and staying later each night, clearly trying to manage multiple crises with the frantic energy of a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable and was only now beginning to understand how wrong he had been. He saw Rachel growing increasingly agitated through the windows of the glass tower, pacing in her office, making phone calls that left her gripping the edge of her desk with white knuckles, and he knew without hearing a single word that the ground beneath her feet was shifting in ways she could not control. The breaking point came on a Wednesday, their usual hotel day, but this time the meeting at the Grandview was brief and heated. Daniel positioned himself in the hotel bar as he had done so many times before, and even from across the lobby he could see that Marcus and Rachel were arguing. Marcus was gesturing wildly with both hands, while Rachel sat rigid in her chair with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. She left after barely 20 minutes, her face flushed dark with anger, and Marcus stayed behind at the bar and ordered 3 whiskeys in a row. That evening, Rachel came home earlier than she had in weeks, and when Daniel looked up from the book he was pretending to read and asked how work had been, she said there was some kind of audit happening and that everyone in the office was on edge. Daniel asked if it was serious, and Rachel said it was probably nothing, just corporate drama over paperwork. But he could see the worry eating away at her composure like acid working through metal. Over the following days, Daniel watched his wife's confidence erode in real time. She jumped every time her phone rang. She stayed late at the office, but Daniel knew she was not meeting Marcus because Marcus was far too busy trying to save his own career to continue their affair. The final domino fell on a Friday morning when Christine Webb's divorce attorney filed papers in Philadelphia that simultaneously named Marcus in an adultery claim and forwarded evidence of his financial crimes to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 agents arrived at the Whitfield and Partners building at 9:17 in the morning and arrested Marcus Webb at his desk in front of the entire office. The charges included embezzlement from a charitable trust, wire fraud across state lines, and tax evasion on unreported income that Marcus had been funneling through his offshore accounts for nearly 3 years. Daniel stood at his office window and watched as Marcus was led out of the building in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face the color of wet cement. and he felt nothing at all except the cold, precise satisfaction of numbers that had finally been balanced. Rachel called in sick that morning, claiming she had the flu, but Daniel knew she was sitting in their bedroom with the curtains drawn, trying to calculate how much of Marcus's disaster was going to splash onto her. That weekend, Daniel made his own decisive move. He spent Saturday morning at the kitchen table with a printer, producing every document he had gathered over the past 2 months. Financial records, surveillance photographs, email printouts, phone logs, hotel receipts, credit card statements, all of it organized in a thick manila folder with the same meticulous precision he had once used for university audit reports. Every page numbered, every entry cross-referenced, every lie cataloged and dated. He waited until Sunday evening when Rachel came downstairs in her bathrobe looking exhausted and hollow, and he placed the folder on the kitchen table between them and said 2 words. "I know." Rachel stared at the folder without touching it, and her face cycled through a series of expressions that Daniel cataloged with clinical detachment, surprise, then denial, then the rapid calculation of someone trying to figure out how much damage control was still possible, and finally resignation settling over her features like a curtain falling at the end of a very long performance. She asked how long he had known, and he told her since the car accident, since Marcus Webb mentioned seeing her in a red dress at a conference she had never told him about. Rachel opened the folder and began turning pages, and Daniel watched her face as she saw the surveillance photographs of herself entering the Grandview Hotel, the records of money transfers from their joint accounts, the hotel receipts with dates that matched every single lie she had told him for months. She said it was a lot of work, and Daniel said he was good at his job. She asked what he wanted, and Daniel told her he wanted her to leave tonight, take whatever she could fit in a suitcase and find somewhere else to live, sign divorce papers that would give him full custody of Lily, and leave Rachel with exactly what she had brought into their marriage 21 years ago. Rachel said it was not fair, and Daniel laughed, and the sound that came out of him was so cold, it surprised even himself. He told her she had stolen from their family to pay her lover's gambling debts, lied to him every day for months, and had been planning to divorce him and take half of everything while hiding the money she had already taken. He asked her what exactly about any of this struck her as fair, and Rachel closed the folder and said she needed time to think. And Daniel said no, she needed to pack. That night, Rachel filled 2 suitcases with clothes and whatever personal belongings she could grab in the hour Daniel gave her, and he helped her carry the bags to her car with the same polite courtesy he had shown her for 2 decades of marriage, because even now, even after everything, Daniel Hartwell was a man who believed in doing things properly. Rachel paused at the driver's side door and asked what he was going to tell Lily, and Daniel said he was going to tell her the truth, because their daughter was 16 years old and old enough to understand that actions carried consequences that no amount of wishing could undo. Rachel drove away into the darkness, and Daniel stood in the driveway watching her taillights shrink to red pinpoints and then vanish entirely around the corner of their quiet suburban street. And he felt hollow inside, scraped clean like a jar someone had emptied and rinsed and set back on the shelf. But beneath the emptiness there was something that felt strangely like relief, because the pretending was finally over. Lily came home from her friend's house an hour later and noticed her mother's absence immediately, the way a person notices when a piece of furniture that has always been in the same spot is suddenly gone. Daniel sat his daughter down in the living room and explained everything, not the photographs because she did not need to see those, but the financial records that proved her mother had been stealing from their family to support a man who was now sitting in a federal holding cell, waiting for a bail hearing he could not afford. Lily listened without interrupting, her face still and serious in a way that made her look much older than 16. And when Daniel finished, she was quiet for a long time, before she said she had known something was wrong. The way her mother looked at her phone, the way she seemed happier when Daniel was not around. And then Lily asked if she could stay with him, and Daniel felt something that had been wound impossibly tight inside his chest, loosen just enough to let him breathe again. The divorce was finalized 4 months later in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. Rachel signed the papers without contesting a single one of Daniel's terms, because she understood that fighting would only result in more of her secrets being dragged into public view. And there were things in that manila folder that could end not just her career, but any chance she had of rebuilding a life that resembled something respectable. Daniel kept the house, the savings accounts, and full custody of Lily. Rachel received her personal belongings and barely enough from the sale of her car to cover her legal fees. Morrison and Associates completed their internal investigation and terminated her employment for violations of company policy. And Daniel had been careful to ensure that her involvement with Marcus's schemes appeared naive rather than criminal. So she avoided prosecution, but her career in compliance was effectively finished. She found work as a receptionist at a small insurance office on the outskirts of Charlotte, making less than half her previous salary, living in a studio apartment and driving a 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door that she could not afford to fix. Marcus Webb pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges and was sentenced to 5 years in a federal correctional facility. Christine divorced him from Philadelphia and moved on with their children, and his apartment on South Boulevard was seized as part of asset forfeiture, along with every dollar in the offshore account that Daniel had traced in 6 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Rachel showed up at Daniel's house on a Saturday morning, while Lily was at a friend's place and Daniel was working in his garden, something he had taken up since the divorce because there was a satisfaction in growing things that he had never expected to find. Rachel looked older and thinner, her hair shorter and streaked with gray, wearing clothes that came from discount stores instead of the department stores she had once frequented. She told Daniel he had destroyed Marcus systematically, like he was a problem that needed solving. And Daniel said he had not destroyed anyone. He had simply made sure the right people knew who Marcus Webb really was. And if the truth destroyed him, then that said more about Marcus than it did about Daniel. Rachel said Marcus had made her feel alive and beautiful, and desired for the first time in years. And Daniel looked at the woman he had shared 21 years with and realized he felt nothing for her at all. Not love, not hatred, not even pity. Just the blank indifference of a man looking at a stranger whose moral compass pointed in a direction he could not comprehend. Rachel asked about Lily, and Daniel told her Lily was doing well in school and had learned an important lesson about the difference between people who kept their promises and people who broke them. And when Rachel said Lily would not even take her calls anymore, Daniel told her that was a choice their daughter had made on her own. Rachel wiped her eyes and asked if Daniel ever thought about what would have happened if he had simply talked to her, told her he knew about Marcus and asked her to end it. Daniel considered the question seriously and then asked if she would have ended it, and Rachel was quiet for a very long time before she said she did not know. And Daniel said, "Then you have your answer." After Rachel left, Daniel sat on the front porch and thought about whether he should feel guilty about any of it. About Marcus sitting in a prison cell, about Rachel working a job she hated in an apartment she could barely afford, about the chain of events he had set in motion from a rented office across the street from a glass tower in downtown Charlotte. But guilt never came. What came instead was something that had been missing from his life for a very long time, and it settled over him like warm sunlight breaking through clouds after months of gray sky. That evening, Lily came home and found Daniel reading on the porch and told him she knew her mother had stopped by earlier. Daniel said Rachel thought he had been too harsh, and Lily sat down in the chair beside him and was quiet for a moment before she said she was glad he handled it the way he did, because if he had just forgiven Rachel and taken her back, she would have spent the rest of her life wondering when her mother was going to lie to them again. Daniel reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand and told her she did not have to choose sides. And Lily looked at him with eyes that were steady and clear and said she was not choosing sides. She was choosing to live with the parent who told the truth. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, a woman named Megan from a book club he had joined at the coffee shop down the street, asking if he would like to have dinner sometime. And Daniel stared at the message for a long moment before he deleted it without responding, because he was not ready for that yet, and maybe he never would be. But sitting on that porch with his daughter beside him, and the evening light turning the sky above Charlotte into shades of amber and violet, Daniel Hartwell realized he had his home, his work, his daughter, and his peace of mind. And after everything that had happened, that felt like enough. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what you would have done in Daniel's place, and subscribe to Sinner Stories so you never miss a new video.